I want to talk about recent allegations of BBC bias against Israel. I say recent accusations, but they're not entirely new. It's just that recently there's been calls for a formal inquiry into the BBC's coverage of the Israel Gaza war. So that's the main thing I want to talk about here, but I'll just touch on the latest escalation in the Near East, which is, of course, these bizarre scenes of exploding pagers. This is the cover of the newspaper yesterday. Just pause it a few seconds so you can pause the screen. I'll just read it out. Hezbollah vows revenge on Israel after exploding pagers kill 9 and injure thousands. And there's been another wave of exploding devices today, 20 killed and hundreds more injured. Up to 3,000 people injured in Lebanon. It's been called the biggest security breach yet. The health ministry says 200 of those injured are in critical condition. Israel's yet to comment, but Hezbollah, which is found to exact punishment for the strike, has launched almost daily attacks on it for months, raising fears of escalation and all-out war, and videos show wounded men in hospitals. There are surreal scenes, you saw the markets and cafes and barber shops, and suddenly devices just exploding. It was kind of surreal to watch. Initially, I must say, I thought it was a technology thing, like we hear about, for example, electric cars going on fire. I thought it was, when I heard Lebanon, I thought, okay, it's the economic crisis there, it's something to do with that. But no, then I heard Hezbollah, and I thought, of course, it's related to Israel and Hezbollah. Um, was Israel behind it? Almost certainly. They're not going to admit it, but I think Mossad has the capabilities of that. Um, no doubt there'll be more to say about the subject if the situation escalates, and unfortunately it probably will. I imagine a lot of people in Lebanon will be very worried at the moment about another full-scale war like in 2006. Um, but it just seems never-ending in this part of the world. Hezbollah's firing rockets at Israel. Israel responds. It just, I will say this. Um, the idea that there's no civilian casualties is nonsense, because Hezbollah, like Hamas, mingles in the civilian population. Now, if you're in proximity to someone who has an exploding device, obviously there's a big risk that other people can get injured. It's still better than aerial bombardment, where you have entire families wiped out, but um, if the Israelis claim there's no civilian casualties, I just think that's implausible. Implausible. So that's going to be a situation to watch. Iran, of course, has its grubby fingers on the situation. The Tehran regime is absolutely toxic in the region. It's just, remember, Iraq is between the Near East and Iran. So I do think Iran should stay the hell out of this, because Israel, for all the legitimate criticism that can be thrown at it, it's not a war with the Iranian people. So why is the Iranian government insisting on escalating this? Um, I want to talk about, like I say, these recent allegations of bias against the BBC, because there's been calls for an inquiry. I'll just say right now, I don't think what the demands are about is actually a call for balance. I think what the advocates of this are really pushing is they want the BBC to put out just pro-Israeli propaganda. I don't think they're really calling for balance, because if you look at the coverage of this war in other sources, like, for example, very pro-Israeli newspapers such as the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail, the coverage is almost entirely focused on the hostages and the awful events of October the 7th. It's almost like the 41,000 Palestinians who've been killed since then are irrelevant. It's a side story, it's a footnote. Um, the most you'll get is the suffering of the Palestinians is the fault of Hamas. Um, I think Hamas bears a lot of responsibility, definitely for initiating this war, definitely for taking hostages, definitely for their terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians, the appalling things they've done to Israeli civilians. And yes, I do think that they have a reckless disregard for Palestinian lives as well. Hamas are not good people. and I don't think they should be lionized as resistance fighters. Look at their human rights record within Gaza. It's appalling. So I think Hamas are contemptible. Also, remember their leaders are millionaires living in Qatar and Istanbul, whilst ordinary Palestinians are suffering profoundly. That says a lot about the thinking of Hamas. We know about the extensive tunnels, we know about their genocidal agenda against Israelis. That's all true. But it is also true that Israel's military actions have directly resulted in civilian deaths and casualties. It is also true that Israel has definitely crossed lines, and IDF troops have done appalling things as well. Um, so the problem I've got with this mentality is, like I say, it's not a call for more balance. It's a call for the BBC to be expected to just put out pro-Israel propaganda, as you get in some of the right-wing newspapers that blindly support Israel. I think actually that when this country, we're a sovereign country, when we arm another country, when we support another country, we have a right to ask questions. Now, if you look at the heat that Starmer and Lamy got for withdrawing some of the arms to Israel, and it was a minuscule proportion actually, in the grand scheme of things. Firstly, the British proportion, although we're the second biggest donor to Israel, is far, far, far less than the American component. And within that, it was only a fraction. So one was almost tempted to say, well, why not just go the whole way if you're going to do it? Because, Starmer and Lamy, on one hand, they anger the pro-Israeli lobby. On the other hand, they didn't go far enough for the pro-Palestinians. So it's sort of a winless situation. But I do feel that our blind support for Israel as a nation, this country supporting Israel, it damages our reputation internationally, certainly across the Arab world. If you look at other Western countries that have supported Israel, Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, France, they've all funded and armed Israel at some point, but I think pretty much all of them have either halted it or put a pause on it because of very grave concerns about Israel potentially breaking international laws. And I'm using diplomatic language here, but I think it's obvious that they have. The targeting of hospitals, the targeting of schools, the targeting of refugee camps. Now, Israel says, well, we do this because Hamas hides among them, but there comes a point when it's not good enough to say, well, Palestinian deaths are unfortunate, they're collateral damage. Queen Rania of Jordan has spoken about the double standards, and you'd be hard-pressed to really say that she's wrong about that, because when it's an Israeli civilian killed by Hamas or Hezbollah, then that's awful, that's a terrorist attack, and it is. But when it's a Palestinian civilian killed in an Israeli airstrike, it's unfortunate, it's collateral damage. I do think there's a desensitization, and I say that because I see people making these tasteless jokes. So they'll talk about Hamas fighters being taken out, and they make jokes and memes about it. But I don't find that remotely funny, not because I sympathize with Hamas, but because unquestionably civilians are killed and injured as well. There's nothing funny about what's happening in the Near East. I just think it's in very bad taste to sort of mock that situation. Without question, the Israeli government has far-right elements that want to starve off the Palestinians, that want to collectively punish the Palestinians. I don't think anyone with a straight face can say that isn't the case. There's been situations where Israeli police have had to fight off far-right extremists who throw rocks at aid convoys, who try to stop them getting into Gaza. There are far-right components of Netanyahu's government that want to just wipe Gaza off the face of the earth. So it's delusional to claim that that isn't prevalent within the Israeli power structure, within the Israeli government. I don't think Netanyahu's approach represents all Israelis. We know that because there's been huge rallies within Israel against Netanyahu. Now, back to this issue about BBC bias. Obviously, the BBC is going to have to respond. Of course, they need to show that they are reporting Hamas is attacks on civilians or continued use of hostages. They need to report the Hezbollah rocket attacks on Israel. Of course, they need to do all of that. But I don't accept that simply talking about Palestinian deaths and allegations against Israel amount to an anti-Israel agenda. In the end of the day, if you have more Palestinian casualties, there's going to be more focus on Palestinian casualties. I don't think that equates to the BBC having an anti-Israel agenda. I do think initially in the war, they, like I said, I think I mentioned this previously, they were wrong to not use the term terrorist because they'd use it in other context. The far-right attack on the mosque in New Zealand, in Christchurch, they called that a terrorist attack. So the BBC isn't really going by its own guidelines on that. So I do think that was bad PR. It looked like they were just being overly cautious and politically correct, and they didn't want to offend people who would be pro-Hamas. Now, that I think that was a big mistake early on, especially given the scale of that series of atrocities in Israel on October the 7th. So the BBC done themselves no favours by refusing to call a terrorist attack a terrorist attack. But I don't accept that simply talking about Palestinian deaths amounts to anti-Israel bias. I mean, would these people, the advocates who are pushing for the BBC to be, to admit it's biased or something, would they really expect, or do they really expect the BBC to just not report Palestinian casualties, to say nothing about the fact thousands of people have been misplaced, injured, killed? That would be the BBC not doing its job. I mean, the irony here is when there was all the anti-Semitism allegations going on in Labour, when the BBC covered that, the hard left in Labour accused the BBC of an agenda and bias. The point I'm making here is the BBC is going to be condemned no matter what it does. If it doesn't report the Palestinian casualties, then the pro-Palestinians will accuse it of a bias. And when it does, then pro-Israelis accuse it of a bias. What they have to do is maintain impartiality as best as possible. But there's this big misconception in journalism that impartiality equates to 50-50 balance. That's not what impartiality is about. Never has been. Because you can't have a situation where thousands of civilians are being killed and wounded, and therefore you could say, oh, well, the other side's it's just 50-50. That's not how honest journalism should work. Honest journalism should be about reporting the facts as they are, as best as possible. So I don't accept this argument that if the BBC or another network covers Palestinian deaths, that equates to. I mean, I've seen Israeli hardliners basically say the BBC equals Hamas. That's nonsense. And you see how toxic this thing is, because in the presidential debate, Trump came out with this complete nonsense that Kamala Harris hates Israel, which is ironic because part of the problem they've had, I mean, as much as she's leading the race, she'd be leading even more if there wasn't this base of the Democratic Party of young Palestinian Americans who are furious with Biden and Harris for being pro-Israel, and Blinken for being pro-Israel. So it's ironic for Trump to claim that she hates Israel when she's being attacked by the far left. And I shouldn't just say the far left, by pro-Palestinians for this perceived bias against Israel and for arming Israel, has to be said. I mean, Harris has spoken about how awful it is that civilians are dying, and she's condemned the high loss of civilians, but it's sort of a contradiction when it's American weapons that are causing a lot of that. So, I mean, I talk about the pro-Israel lobby in this country and, our support for Israel, but it's 99% America. It really is a huge, huge portion of support for Israel. But I just have a problem with this premise that we as a sovereign nation state, should blindly support another country. Now, some people might say here, well, what about Ukraine? Well, I see big differences, and I think I'll probably cover that in another video. But um, I'm basically defending the BBC to some extent here because I think they're not being asked to be more balanced. They're being asked to put out pro-Israel propaganda. Um, they're being asked to basically regurgitate whatever the IDF spokesman or spokeswoman says. I don't entirely trust Israeli sources, quite frankly. I certainly don't trust Hamas sources, but I don't entirely trust Israeli sources. Um, I think, it must be very hard for BBC journalists on the ground when they're trying to do their level best to then be told they're pro Hamas or pro Israel, whatever. Um, a lot of the people attacking them don't have, they're not on the ground. They're not seeing what those journalists are saying. Also, aside from the fact they're risking their lives, even outside of the war zone, there's been reports of BBC staff are having actually mental health problems because of the sheer level of vitriol that is being directed against them. That's wrong. So to some extent, I think the BBC should stand its ground a little bit and say we're not going to apologise for talking about Palestinian casualties. I almost think the BBC's problem is it wants to please everyone and it tries too hard to please everyone. Um, I actually think to some extent on this occasion they've a right to stand their ground. Early in the war, I criticised the BBC. I still think they were wrong not to call a terrorist attack a terrorist attack. But at this point, um, I just don't accept that talking about Palestinian deaths, pointing out the fact that Israel has been accused of committing war crimes, it does not equate to the BBC having an anti-Israel agenda. Of course, they need to keep reporting about the crimes of Hamas and Hezbollah as well, and I actually think they do. Indeed, early in this war, a lot of the coverage about the attacks of October the 7th, ironically, came from the BBC, so the people now attacking the BBC might not have initially known about that without looking at BBC reports. So the BBC is going to be condemned whatever it does. So to some extent, I think they should stand their ground here. They should say, we're going to listen to your concerns, but we're not going to have a situation where we're just going to put out pro-Israel propaganda. That wouldn't be doing their job either. And I think that's what some people are demanding. And if I'm wrong about that, I would challenge them. Prove it. Do you really want balance? Or do you want the BBC to just be blindly, unwaveringly supportive of Israel? A final thing I'll say, anti-Semitism is poisonous. There have been clear examples of anti-Semitism in this country. Jewish people have had an increased sense of fear. That is appalling in Europe in the 21st century. I've seen footage, for example, there was a young Jewish lad going to a synagogue. He got pelted by rocks. There's been a lot of ugly incidents like that. So anti-Semitism is poisonous. Anti-Jewish conspiracy theories are poisonous. All that stuff has to be condemned. But I do think there are some pro-Israelis who will use it as an excuse to deflect legitimate criticism of Israel. There shouldn't be this thing whereby someone can't criticize Israeli policies and far-right Israeli extremists and not also criticize anti-Semitism. I know for myself I've tried very hard to do both. Um, and criticizing the Israeli government does not automatically equate to being pro-Hamas. So again, if you look at the sort of bias in some British newspapers, there isn't even a mention of Palestinian deaths. So I think that's what these people are demanding of the BBC. No, that would not be honest journalism either. You don't want a situation. Well, I don't want a situation where the BBC is just putting out pro-Israel propaganda. That's not honest to what's happening out there. Any more than it would be putting out pro-Hamas propaganda. I think it's a very, very difficult job in a situation like this in a war zone where it is so emotive and people have such strong views on this conflict. So I think BBC journalists need tough skin. But I've seen those interviews where you get IDF spokesmen and they visibly lose their temper and berate the BBC. The BBC shouldn't be bullied into silence in that sense, to just put out pro-Israel propaganda. I think they almost need to be a little bit more defensive in some ways, and actually say, look, we're covering these things and we're not going to apologize for it because they have to be covered. That's my take on this. But that all being said does not in any way mean Hamas's appalling crimes should be downplayed either by anyone.